My name is Greg Fuliente. I'm the shadowy advisor, and I'm coming in to introduce to you our keynote speakers. You would be able to read their background in the note, the booklet, and we're going to start with Thomas and Harpa now, and we'll have Professor Matt Santamores later on. And I'm going to introduce Thomas and Harpa together because I've known them for a long time. Apart from the official biographical sketch you can read, I'll give a little bit more personal thought about them. I've known Thomas for 20 years, and we've done a lot of things together in the spirit of the DBI network concept. We have called for a researchers' collaboration call for working more effectively with policymakers and stakeholders worldwide. And you can sign up. It's around the building. You can sign up for that. And we held a session last Friday in COP29 in Baku, where I was the keynote speaker, and there was a discussion hosted by the Nordic Council of Ministers Pavilion, which is linked to our Harpa and the Nordic countries. So these two people are pioneers in the area of decarbonization, whole life decarbonization. And it is our great privilege to have them here with us in Australia. Because Thomas is architect of many things that you've been using. You probably didn't recognize that A1BCD framework through CEN and ISO and the DGNB framework, the BNB framework, very influential through standards work. And Harpa, I've known Harpa for 14 years, who during that period in IEA Annex 89, 57 and 72 gave birth to 2 babies and gave birth to the massive development and advance of whole life carbon program in Denmark and of course Nordic countries. And then, so these two are pioneers. So it's our great privilege and pleasure. We welcome them here. First Thomas, and then followed by Harpa, and then later on, Professor Matt Santamores.
Okay, thank you, dear Greg. So thank you, Greg, dear colleague, dear friend, for inviting us. And this is true. The next 2 presentations will create a package. I take a more global perspective and a European perspective, and my colleague Harpa will later on explain you the details based on an example from Denmark, the famous Denmark example, let us say. So let me start with my presentation, dear colleagues. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear old friends, dear new friends, and let me also say hello to my colleagues and friends and girlfriends from Annex 89. How can building industry become rescuer and winner requirements and recommendations? Decarbonizing building industry, it sounds so easy. We need a target, but oops, there is not just one target. We have to think about target systems and target conflicts also. We need appropriate instruments. My colleague and friend Greg would say we need the tambourine, the sticks, and the carrots. They are hanging on the wall in each office, I'm afraid, here. Let's talk about this later again. For sure, we need the indicators and the monitoring. Are we on the right way? Is this the right direction? How much we have consumed already and how to achieve our target. But this sounds a little bit generic. In any case, we have to invite all the actors. These are the so-called built environment professionals, and you can see there are a lot of us. And so we have to include the actors and to convince the stakeholders. But the question is now, what is new? What is new? If we go back 1921, you can read in books in Germany, if you like to save coal, you have 3 options. Use less coal to produce construction products, improve the energy efficiency of your heating system, reduce energy demand of your building. 100 years ago, and construction products, so-called embodied impacts, are on place number 1. Look, in a certain way, we are following always a crisis. After World War I, there was a scarcity in coal. So we are calculating with coal. Later on, there was the oil crisis, so we are using oil equivalent. Later on, there was all about primary energy, non-renewable. And in our days, we are talking about global warming. So we can ask ourselves what will be the next crisis and what will be the next indicator. I think we will see soon raw material consumption. And we are not on track. This is very clear. I must not tell you this. And I am also not coming here to talk about problems in Australia. I'm coming here to explain you the problems in my home country. So we are also not on track. This is a problem. But this is the overall situation, and we are here representing a so-called sector, but I prefer the term area of action, because sector, this is a tricky term if you ask our colleagues from macroeconomy. There is no building sector in macroeconomy. We can talk about construction and real industry, or area of action, or area of needs like housing. So in a certain way, we are the elephant in the room, the construction and real estate industry. And let us take the old term from the Beatles with little help from my friends. So we are the friends of the society because we have the potential to help the society by reducing greenhouse gas emission. I will come back to this in some minutes. But there is a certain problem of awareness. The same organization is telling us, oh, construction industry is contributing 6% to global warming, right-hand side, and left-hand side, it's close to 37%, including direct, indirect, and so-called embodied greenhouse gas emissions. So what is true? Most of the politicians know the figure right-hand side to say, oh, construction industry. Let's take care about chemical industry, mobile industry, heavy industry, but just pour some buildings, it doesn't matter. But we can have impact. Let us say we are not responsible. I dislike this. We are responsible for 37%. We can make an impact on 37%, and this is our role in this game. But, dear ladies and gentlemen, there is a certain problem. Policymakers like to come out with years. And there is a race around the world, 2050, no, 2045, let's take 2035. But this is more or less fantasy. In reality, we have to follow the budget. And this is a science-based approach, and we are here the researchers. So we should trust a science-based approach. And now, surprise, our budget is over, not 2050, but 2032. What happens? We have to speed up, ladies and gentlemen. It's a nightmare to say, oh, up to 2050. Let's take our time. We go slowly, improving the methods, improving the data, improving the knowledge. But in a certain way, in 5 years from now, we have to come out with good results. This is our problem. We have to speed up. And in Australia and in Ireland, take this as an example from Europe, we're doing things like this. We call this mitigation pathway. But I'm not so sure this is a mitigation pathway we are talking here about. I'm sure this is a projection, a forecast, and not a mitigation pathway. By the way, left-hand side, Australia, this is just one example out of literature. If you like to see better examples, ask my friend colleague Greg and his colleagues, his younger colleagues. They are working for this, and I really recommend his model. But at the very end, we must make a difference between a mitigation pathway. This is a top-down approach, taking into account the budget. From the other point of view around the world, and at the moment we are right in time looking to the COP, yes, there are a lot of pledges, nice pledges. But at the very end, you can take a projection, and later on you will follow the monitoring. And always you like to see a gap. First of all, there is an ambition gap, and later on there is a solution gap. In Germany, we call this double failure problem. At first, our targets are not strong enough, and secondly, we are not able to meet our targets. This is double failure. So we, again, must more powerful to solve our problems. And we come to a problem again. So it's about green talk. We like to listen to green talks. The question is, we are on a green walk already, and what about walking the talk? And, surprise, now you can see this is already official language. Look to the front page of the last report. no more hot air, please. And you know this metaphor, hot air, it's just talking, nice talking. And look there, a gap between rhetoric and reality. So they are aware of this, the problem with green walking and green talking. And so we are the engineers, we should think about real performance and not just expectations. By the way, in Europe, there is a new law, a new requirement. If you talk just about climate friendly without showing figures, there is a legal risk, because now greenwashing is a legal problem. So please be careful if you come to Europe and give a speech about climate friendly buildings. You have to show the figures. By the way, we have to speed up. And again, you can see also my colleagues in Denmark, they are convinced we have to speed up. There are scenarios. The budget is over already, 2029. And you can see Harpa will come back to this later on. But our message together is 2050 is too late to create a target year. In any case, we have to speed up. In a certain way, what we have to do is we must create ambitious climate mitigation pathways. And if not, we run into serious problems. And I have learned yesterday from my colleagues here, AC/DC is still very popular here in Melbourne. Sorry, I was not able to invite the band for a quick, but we are on the way, on the highway to hell. We are not able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I invite you for the details. Please come to Annex 89, the famous one, to look to the details. All my colleagues are here well prepared to give you the details. And this takes place already this afternoon. So see you again this afternoon in any case. But there is also a problem, dear colleagues. There is a problem. What is the industry we like to decarbonize here? It sounds good, building industry. What is the meaning of building industry? I'm not so sure. Look, in Europe, they use now the so-called term ecosystem. From my point of view, this creates the next confusion, because other scientists have totally different idea about the meaning of an ecosystem. But why not? Let us say it's an industrial system or whatever. But you see, it's very complicated, and it's much more than construction industry as such. So from my point of view, we should enlarge system boundaries to integrate all the actors and stakeholders taking the decisions. And therefore, in a certain way, perhaps it's better to talk about built environment professionals or things like this. How it's defined. So in any case, it's a network of actors, and we will see a mass flow, an energy flow, but also a flow of information among the actors along the supply chain. And there's for sure also a network of responsibility. And so therefore, it's really necessary to fully understand this network here. And we can also follow, left-hand side, you can see the famous modules to describe the life cycle of a building. And we can add to this what type of industry is included. Construction product industry, transport industry, construction industry, and so on. But we have to fully understand that we have to take into account all this, and everybody can contribute, but who makes the impact? First of all, the consultants and the designers. But this is just the surface. In many conferences, we're discussing how we can convince the designers. But from my point of view, a more important question is how we can convince the clients, how we can invest the sponsors or the owners or the investors, because they have to ask for low carbon building, they have to pay for low carbon building, and they give the tasks to the designer to create a low carbon building. But this is not the last line. Behind the investors, there are the banks. And translated into the bank world and language, unsustainability is a risk. It's a financial risk. And there are the regulators, and behind this, there are and is the society. There was a research based by Deutsche Bank in the past, Some Like It Hot. This was a famous movie in the past. Perhaps most of you are too young to understand this joke, Some Like It Hot. Nevertheless, I think it was related to Marilyn Monroe far away in the past. Look, construction and associated sectors can become double winner if we are clever enough. Because what we need is transformation of national building stocks. And if we are doing right, and if there is a certain willingness to pay and willingness to act in the society, this will create jobs. This will create income for construction and real estate industry. So if possible, we become winners. And we are in a very specific situation as a group here. We are the persecutors because we causing, let us say, energy and mass flow and impacts to global and local environment. We are victims because we are affected already by the impacts of climate change on a local level. But because we have an impact on the 40%, we are rescuer also. Let's try to become a zero hero in the society, the building sector. What can we learn from World Economic Forum and others? There is a company level. Some of you here will represent the companies. So you can see you get a premium more than 10% on your ESG rating. But on a building level, you have higher asset value, you have higher rental income, you have a better rentability and marketability. And this can be shown based on economic data in the real estate market. So there are advantages for different perspectives, for the companies, but also for the buildings, and at the very end, to the society. You can see here in Europe, they have now a so-called monitor, and you can see also on the company level, most of the companies, especially in the small and medium enterprises, are highly motivated in energy saving, minimizing waste, saving water and others. And they have already a carbon reduction strategy in place in most of the cases already, because this is sustainability reporting on company level. Also, this creates a certain pressure on the companies. I'll go back. We can have a look to the figures from real estate industry. And here you can see the so-called green premium. You can get more money if you have a green building. Sometimes it's not enough to show the advantages to motivate people. To say, green premium or not, I have enough income. So in a certain way, we should try to show the risk, because you make the real estate people nervous if you come out with the message, you will lose money. We call this brown discount. So green premium is one, but brown discount is the other side, to say, oh, if you have a high carbon building, an unsustainable building, this will create risk, but also financial risk. We call this brown discount. And for sure, we have to ask the people, if we have climate change in the future, perhaps we have to live in yellow submarines, but most of the people prefer to live in green buildings. But there must be a very clear language. If you look to Europe, we have competing initiatives. One is zero emission, and the next one is zero emission. One is about greenhouse gas emissions, and one is emission on construction sites. This is not the same, but the same terms. You can see there is a really a source of crazy, let us say, crazy mixtures out of different terms. So we really need clear terms and definitions to have a better idea of what we are talking about here this time. And there is a new game around the world. Oh, let me coordinate all the others, because we need a harmonized approach. Different organizations at the moment try to come out with harmonized approaches, but who will harmonize the harmonizers? You can see typically if we talk about the assessment methods, we have to talk about the modules, when to carry out the assessment, what is the reference study period, and things like this. And at the minimum, we should fight for more transparency. And there is also a good job sharing between legal requirements and standardization. Also this I recommend to you to learn from Europe. this job sharing to say, oh, the legal requirements are on a more generic level. And for the engineers, all the details are part of a standard because it's easier to adapt the standard than to adapt a legal requirement. So legal requirement would be a framework. And we will have in Europe some frameworks like this, especially so-called delegated act, how to calculate, let us say, greenhouse gas emissions. But by the way, we can also learn from Europe, just reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not enough. We have to do this, and this was mentioned by you, dear colleague, already. We have to enlarge the scope, and we have to include also the other perspectives, and we have to say, at the minimum, climate mitigation is okay, but do not significant harm the adaptation, the water saving, the circularity, the pollution prevention, and the protection of biodiversity, and we can enlarge for sure this. By the way, dear colleagues from Australia, we miss you because Greg, my friend, is there, but not representing Australia. He is representing our ISPA, the International Initiative for Sustainable Built Environment, the most powerful phantom organization of the world, able and ready to come out with world conferences. The last one was 2008 here in this town, coordinated by Greg. So you see, it's all about standards in certification, and this is what we are talking about here also. It's all about demand creation, finance, and investment. It's very similar to your list of topics in this conference here. Again, we miss you, so it's not too late. The main activity will start next year in front of COP30. At the very end, climate action is not enough, let us say, and this is also true by buildings breakthrough. Buildings breakthrough will nearly zero emission buildings and resilient buildings to the new normal, but not in front of 2050, in front of 2030. This is now international level to say this is a self-commitment to say let us speed up to achieve such a goal in front of 2030 already. So, ladies and gentlemen, what's next? We should, as a researcher already, 2 steps in front of the actual list. You perhaps are surprised with my first line, but if you look to the economic and environmental value of existing national building stock, you should take care. You should maintain the environmental and economic value of the existing building stock. We need more regular maintenance. You have heard about Germany. Bridges breaks down, fall into the river in a country like Germany. What a disaster, what a shame. Therefore, we need more, let us say here, maintenance. We need refurbishment, and the next topic will become circularity. And some final recommendations. We must communicate the importance of construction and real estate industry. We should go to the polluter's pays principle because in national statistics we are source-based and not polluter-based principle. We have to come to mandatory requirements to limit greenhouse gas emissions. We have to undertake a sustainability assessment for climate protection measures to see advantages and disadvantages. At the very end, we must integrate this into the appraisal process, and we should improve the digital information flow. In this case, building industry can become a rescuer and winner. But a final remark, please. This is not the only target. We should go from mitigation pathway to transition pathway to achieve at the very end a safe and fair built environment. And this is just much more than just climate neutrality. So this is our long way. And I will hand over to Harper now, but I will allow me a small joke to say, if we are able to achieve this target, we can show each other our personal SDG flag. I get this especially from my kids to motivate me, and so I like to motivate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I have also a motivation flag from my research group. So this is my motivation flag, a gift from my research group. Thank you very much for the invitation to present, from my point of view, building's role in the climate crisis, the status, possibilities, and needs, and from a Danish perspective. So there is no doubt about the environmental challenges that we are facing for the climate, planetary boundaries, and our resources. The IPCC gives us reports for the last 30 years or more about the status of the climate, year after year giving the same message about the urgency. But just now recently, of course, much more threatening urgency that we need to face. And they are giving us scenarios about emissions that we are emitting and the scenarios for how it will affect our future. Looking into the development in our temperature rise, in the Arctic sea level, and for example, or in the sea level and the Arctic ice, and so on and so forth. And we know that this is serious scenarios we are looking into, and we are looking into some scenarios that have always been far away in the future. But what we are facing now is that it's not that far in the future, these scenarios that we are facing. So during this time, there have been a lot of actions or discussions, but not resulting in enough action to change the curve. And while we are looking at this climate urgency, which is of course quite complicated, our ecosystem is much more complex, and we need to make sure that we don't forget only focusing on the climate, but also on the other environmental aspects. And therefore, the planetary boundaries have also been introduced, and we have been looking into the health of the whole ecosystem with the planetary boundaries. And for that, to maintain the health of our ecosystem, we need to stay with our human activities within the safe operating space. But as the status is now, is that 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been exceeded due to our human activities. And we need to look into possibilities for how to reverse this and stay within the safe operating space. And the planetary boundaries, as they are defined today, they are very good, but they do not totally cover also to look into our resource use. One way of trying to illustrate and measure our use of resources, we have this Earth Overshoot Day, which look into the use of natural resources and how much resources we are using. And we should be using, of course, the amount of resources that can make us have Earth or planet in balance. In Denmark, first, we have the Earth Overshoot Day on March 16th, and this year, 12 days earlier than the year before. I looked up in Australia, it's April 5th, and globally, it's September 1st. So after 7 months of the year, we have been using the amount of resources that we should be using to have a healthy planet and a planet in balance. And also, we have been talking about, you maybe have known that we in Denmark, we have already legislation for new constructions on the climate issue. So you have a ceiling of the embodied carbon or the whole life carbon you can emit from new constructions. And this is just a recent legal requirement in our building code. And being one of the first, among the first countries in the world working with this, perhaps you can look at yourself a little bit as ambitious, because it's a bit ambitious to look into having limits to the emission of how much carbon you can emit from buildings. So it is ambitious to work with how you can reduce your emissions compared to what you have been doing when you're building as usual. But when we look into our emissions from buildings and comparing it to how to fill the budget that we have for construction to fill the Paris Agreement, then even with ambitious requirements as you have in Denmark, we are exceeding the budget of the Paris Agreement for buildings for around 220%. At least there's a lot of things that we need to do. So although we are not on track in Denmark, then I'm very thankful that I can still be invited to tell a little bit about our journey for whole life carbon journey for the building sector in Denmark. So in the past, there has been a lot of focus in Denmark on reducing the energy consumption in building and looking into really trying to have more ambitious requirements to the energy use in buildings. And if you look into the 60 years, yeah, there are really good results somehow in the requirements that we have in the energy use of building. And I'm not going to then discuss more about then when people use the building, they tend to use more energy than was intended. But let's keep that. But now the focus in on the entire life cycle of a building. And if I look a little bit about how has this been happening in Denmark, then I can say that it has been like a 12-year journey with focus on life cycle assessments in building. So around year 2011 and 12, the Green Building Council in Denmark was established, and that's the same has been happening in almost all countries. But what was chosen in Denmark was to use the German certification system for buildings, the DGNB system. And what was a bit special about that compared to many other systems that are used in the Green Building Council is that you have to conduct a full life cycle assessment of the buildings. So for about 12 years, there has been some experience with the use of life cycle assessments in some parts of the building industry in Denmark. Not all, but also a lot of data have been gathered. But then, of course, there's also been some initiatives from the government. First, in 2014, where they have this ambition of introducing something, we want to have a sustainability class in our building code. This was a vision, but what it meant also, we started developing a tool for LCA for buildings, and we launched this tool, LCA Byg, which is our national tool to make LCA of buildings. The government, it took a little while to develop the sustainability class, so it was like 6 years later. In 2020, they introduced the sustainability class, and if you ask me, I think it was a bit too late, so it didn't really have the effect. But what also happened in 2020 was that the government also asked a lot of different industries in Denmark to give recommendations for how they should to reduce the climate impacts in different sectors. And in one was the construction industry, were asked to give recommendation to the government. And there in 2020, they said, among many other things, we should have legal requirements in the building code, CO2 limits for buildings. So that was like a gift to the government. I think it was a good trick from the government to ask the industry to be engaged. And then a year later, they had this national strategy for sustainable construction with the requirement that 2 years later, we would have a CO2 limit in the building code. So this is a brief 12 years story about the use of LCA in the building sector in Denmark. Very quickly, we developed this LCA tool, a national tool for the Danish building sector. It has been used almost 10 years now, a national freely available tool, where the goal has been to have a neutral and reliable tool to provide the same climate calculator for everyone, and also to be free. It has been free all the time, but now maybe it has to be cheap for the industry in Denmark. With this tool, a lot of people have knowledge how to perform calculations. When we started this, nobody wanted to develop tools. The market is different now. A lot of private actors want to develop tools, so we have to question how if we can still be providing a free tool due to market issues. But this has been a very good thing for the industry. Also, what has been important for us to gather knowledge in the climate impact of new buildings. A lot of focus has been on the new buildings. And one of our tasks in the university was to establish sufficient data background on climate impact of buildings in Denmark over the life cycle to prepare for these legal requirements that had been introduced. So in 2020, we we had this report with 60 building cases. It didn't sound a lot now. It doesn't sound a lot now, but at that time it was quite a lot, also when you look internationally. You were introduced to these life cycle phases and modules and so on earlier, and we make some simplifications in our methods in Denmark. So the red ones are showing the ones we are including at the moment in our calculations. And the results of the 60 cases was that you can see that we have a variation of the different building types from around 6 kilograms to around 14 kilograms per square meter per year, calculated over a 50 years reference period. And what you can also see from this figure is that around 75% of the emissions in Denmark are coming from the materials, while around 25% is coming from the operational energy when we calculate over 50 years. There are a lot of details here that I will not be able to dig into, but we have a lot of reports available also in English to look into this. What we learned from this was that there is a lot of variation, so there must be also a lot of potential to reduce the impacts. When we look into the embodied impacts that we did not look into earlier, because the focus was on energy, we can also see that there is a huge variation. So there must be something some potential to reduce here. And what we got in this legislation that was introduced in 2021 and it was introduced in 2021 but started 2 years later in 2023, they had this same vision as they had been working with for the energy requirements, to say, okay, we should have the goals from 2023, but we should always know they will be then strengthened every second year. And the red line is also, we hope that we will have a lot of ambitious actors in the building industry in Denmark working with this voluntary CO2 limits, the lower ones. So that has been introduced, but we actually don't know totally yet, although we have 1.5 years, almost 2 years with this, the status of how many are using, for example, fulfilling the voluntary class. So just to looking into our 60 cases and how the level of the limit values. So the limit value was chosen in 2023 to be 12 kilograms CO2 per square meter per year. Looking into the line, you can see that almost all of it was 90% of the buildings that we had calculated could fulfill that. But people knowing that huge part of the industry did not learn how to make LCA and so on. It has been a lot of discussions, is this ambitious enough? If you recall, the 220% exceed, I told you about how we are exceeding the Paris Agreement budgets, then of course it's not ambitious enough in terms of climate, but in terms of knowledge in the building sector is perhaps ambitious. And this is how they were aiming for in the future. But remember this 12 kilogram CO2 per square meter per year, because I will be showing you some numbers afterwards here. Then we have to prepare for the 2025 limit. So we also published a report last year where we now have less than 300 cases, and you can see a huge variation in our numbers. But what we needed to look into was what are typically built in Denmark. So here, the orange ones are the ones that are typically built in Denmark, and the blue ones are the ones that are, some good cases, but they are not representative of what is being built when we look into the whole building sector of Denmark. So we have then a set of 163 representative cases. And now look at the numbers again. They are the same as we had for the 60 cases. From 6 to around 14 is actually the same range as we had 2 years earlier. But what you can see also is that we have some new data that we are calculating with, both updated data on our operational energy, the orange one, and also on the materials. So we can see now with our new data, only 10% is coming from the operational energy and 90% from the materials. So the focus in Denmark, due to renewable energy in our energy supply, is for this on the embodied impacts, but of course we should also focus on our energy use in buildings. I'm not saying that. We can now also, with more data, divide it into different building types. We could not do that as much with our 60 cases. And then we had the negotiations, the political negotiations for the limit values for the next year, that is taking in 2025. The A was going from 12 to around 10.5. But what happened was that this will be the new limit values. And you can see that from this, a lot has changed. So when we look into our representative case studies, then only 15% of our cases can fulfill the requirements that we will have next year. So a lot has to happen in the building sector in Denmark. Why did this happen? So the goal was from 10.5, was partly due to a lot of pressure from the industry. And Thomas mentioned the reduction roadmap. Around 600 companies, they were supporting the reduction roadmap and saying, okay, we really need to focus on our limited budgets and so on. So therefore, there was a lot of pressure on the politicians to go much lower. So this will be the limit values from next year. So this was from new buildings, what's happening. And I'm not going to, existing buildings is quite important. And we need to also really focus on existing buildings and to avoid demolition and new builds and focus on the preservation and renovation or retrofit of our existing buildings. We have some research on this. Not too much, I have to say, but it's quite an important topic. There are some, all our research shows that it is better to preserve our existing building stock, to renovate it. It will be better for whole life carbon, for the upfront emissions and for resources and so on. And we have also made some reports to focus on how can we also have like legal requirements on embodied carbon when you renovate, because we should also think about that, because we can also see from our cases that there's a huge variation also here. But this has not been like decided yet, so there's not, it's still not in the building code. So I will not go further on existing buildings, although it's a quite important topic. But our serious urgency, what can we do about this for buildings? So we can do what I've been talking about for the building code and so on, but we really need to talk also about sufficiency and absolute targets. We need to also talk about consumption of space, the use of square meters. That is not affected at the moment by the building code. But if you just look into, in Denmark, the personal use of spaces is quite high, 54 square meter per person in living spaces. And what we can see, for example, just for the single family home has been like increasing from 120 to 213 square meter over a period of 60 years. So there's a huge development in increased use of space, and also that we are not really effectively using our space. So that is, of course, what we need to talk about. We also need to talk about our consumption. Also, there's a lot focus on that. There is a lot of demolition and new build also taking place in Denmark. Tendencies for demolition of, for example, 50 years old single family homes that are smaller and where larger ones are built at the same place. And also things that are not, I call it stuff, not covered by our building code, but is affecting our numbers of emissions. For example, kitchens that on average are like renewed every 11th year, which is not, is totally above the technical lifetime of the kitchens, so on. And what we need to focus on are absolute targets, going from reducing the way we build today and focus on that we have absolute targets. So one example then, when you're talking about absolute targets, about if you're fulfilling the Paris Agreement, then we know what budgets we have left. And we need to try to scale that down to a person in Denmark and scale it down to the buildings, how we can work with that for a square meter of building. We have been dealing a little bit in a different research project on this, but we don't have the perfect solution to work with it. But here, this is, for example, there where we have been comparing which pathway we should be on for fulfilling the Paris Agreement, and the red one showing where the building regulation limits are. So that's where we have this, that we are exceeding the pathway for Paris Agreement by 220%. And then we have had another very important project in Denmark, which is called the residential buildings from 4 to 1 planet, like trying to say we at least need to reduce by 75%, and actually we need to reduce more. And here, the reduction roadmap has been one very important part of that, where we're looking again into absolute target that we have and how we need to reduce. So this reduction roadmap has had quite an effect in Denmark. And in this same project, we also had the opportunity to make a study to look into the potential that we have in residential buildings to reduce the climate impacts. And here we studied a lot of the green studies, the green case studies, and comparing to the conventional one. And we can see that there are a lot of potentials to really reduce the climate impacts of buildings. So there are a lot of best practice cases out there, real building cases that have been built with much lower carbon footprint. But this is just some few cases, but they are not like, they are not becoming conventional practice in Denmark yet. And this is how they have been mapped. The crosses are the cases, how they've been mapped into our reduction roadmap. So we can see that it is actually possible to be on the path. We don't have the solutions to be in the safe operating space, or we don't have the solutions to be under the goal of this project that is 2.5 kilograms CO2 per square meter per year, but we can get close to that. And what you can see now, this is just from this week, that there are different projects coming also on the market in Denmark saying, now we have figured out this 6-floor building cases that can stay within 4.7 kilograms CO2 per square meter per year. And the newest one, the 2 floors with 2 kilograms compared to the legal requirements of 12. So there are a lot of good stories happening there, but we need to figure out how to move from conventional to best practice. And I need to speed up. From the focus from now on will be focusing on, from me at least, to focus on how we can be building within planetary boundaries. So we don't know the status yet of where building within planetary boundaries where it is, and we also need to find solutions for how to stay there. So I will speed up. I just want to mention, like it was mentioned before, that the importance of international cooperation and harmonization, and we have been participating in many of those projects. And what I have to tell, for me, it has been quite important for us to be a part of this, because it gives a lot of input to the development in Denmark to be able to have this different cooperation on international basis. But what I have to say is the processes are still much too slow. Our harmonization processes are too slow. The European requirements for whole life carbon buildings come much too late. They're aiming for that should be happening in 28 or 30 and so on. The standardization processes are also progressing very slow, and it affects the data availability that we have for our LCA requirements. So we have to figure out a way to face, we have an urgency, and how then to change our processes to work with this. And finally, we look into scenarios that are very far in the future, and we are looking into something in year 2100. And we are looking into buildings with lifetime, not a lifetime, we have reference study periods of 50 years and lifetimes that are much longer. And in a way, it looks very far away. But if I go to on a personal note, then we have to figure out and talk about does climate change in the future matter for us? And now I'm going into literature, Icelandic literature and so on, and looking into when is someone you live still alive? And if I will be so lucky to become 90 years old, I will have more than 40 years to love my children. And if my children becomes 90 years old, they will still be alive in year 2100. And if I become a grandmother, maybe in, I don't know, 10 or 20 years or so, I will be so lucky to love my grandchildren for 20 to 30 years. And if they will become 90 years, they will still be alive in 2130. When we think that the scenarios in the IPCC reports are very complicated and telling something very far in the future, we have to remember that how we impact the future does affect the ones that we know now and we love, and the ones that we don't know yet, but that we will love. So we still have a choice today. So that is why we still have to keep fighting for changes. Thank you.